G'day you mob, welcome back to the Goss, where I sit down with my dad on a weekly basis and have a bit of a natter, have a bit of a yarn. So, this week, I'm sitting down again with Dad. This is the second half of last week's episode, and we're talking about the recent Chinese racist incidents in Australia because of COVID. Now, there have been a few racist incidents involving Chinese people being targeted, and we talk about, is Australia really a racist country? We also touch on immigration and cultural values in Australia and other countries like China and Japan. And we talk about conservation efforts for the Norfolk Island Morepork owl. So this owl was incredibly endangered. The population had declined all the way down to a single female in the 80s, but it has bounced back. And then lastly, guys, continuing with the theme of Norfolk Island, we talk about why Norfolk Island was a literal hell on earth during the convict era in Australia and some of the peculiar things that convicts ended up doing as a result of it being so harsh an environment. So with that aside, guys, kick the kookaburra in the tail and let's begin. What's happening with the Chinese racism in Australia at the moment? And that is not Chinese people in Australia being racist to Australians. That is apparently other Australians being racist towards Chinese Asian people. This seems to be in the news. A lot of my friends are sharing it a lot, and I keep trying to say to them, like, yes, it's not okay. It's a big problem, but at the same time, it's getting blown out of proportion. Where I think there was a woman on TV saying when they were asking her what happened, what was the racist incident, and she said someone rolled their eyes at me at the supermarket, and you're just like, what? Like,
I know, yeah, and it's that, and it's happening in other places as well. It's happening in
it's
Britain,
happening all over the world.
In America,
it's happening in China towards Africans and Europeans as well.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Just people are afraid, right?
People are afraid. It's that, you know, when people are afraid, nervous, anxious, I think their natural xenophobia will come out, and that's being xenophobic is one. Well, I think we're, as a species, we're tribal. We've grown up in small. We're a small social group animal.
Yeah.
Look at chimpanzees as the closest thing to humans. Chimpanzees are small social group animals. They do not like outsiders.
Yeah. Well, they tend to kill them.
They do. And humans have grown up being the same thing. Yeah. We've been tribal. We've fought other tribes for a million years. And so I think it is just a natural inbuilt tendency in our DNA that says something that is different we don't like. Now, that doesn't excuse racism at all. I just think it's an underlying natural behaviour that humans have to not like something that's different.
It's the type 1, type 2 error sort of thing, right? Where it's better to, in terms of survival, assume the worst and there not actually be a problem than to assume there's no problem and for there to really be one. Like if you hear the tiger but there's no tiger, that's a better situation to be in than not hear the tiger and there be a tiger.
Exactly.
So if you're being racist towards someone, or at least relying on xenophobia as a social construct or a social, behaviour, obviously has a place because it pays when it is helpful.
Yeah, and that's on an evolutionary basis.
Yes.
On a human cultural basis, there's no excuse for racism at all, ever. To assume that an individual person's behaviour is based on their race is so unreasonable at every level that even you look at the evidence and it's just not true.
Well, it's so hard though, isn't it? Because it is wired into us, and I think we're all to some degree not necessarily racist in that we think one race is better than another, but definitely maybe xenophobic where you treat different groups differently because you don't understand them or you fear their culture, right? Yeah. Like Christians versus Muslims, or, even if I were to suddenly find myself living in a town full of Indians or Vietnamese people, it wouldn't be that I thought that I was better than them or that they were below me, but I would definitely feel less comfortable because I wasn't as familiar with the culture.
Right.
And so I wouldn't understand things, right? And that's where people don't necessarily understand that the uncomfortableness can then bleed into racism and
I think there's going to be a small minority of people in our population, in any population in any country, who are going to be just and I'll use the term natural arseholes.
Yeah.
That underlying inbuilt bit of their DNA comes to the surface much more quickly. And the cases where we had a young woman of Chinese background. Turned out she was actually an Australian, of Chinese heritage.
That is why I would never be confident to attack anyone here, even if I was a racist.
But she was attacked in the street in Melbourne.
She might have been here longer than I have in terms of my heritage.
Exactly. And look, there are others where we've got hundreds of thousands of broadly Asian, not just Chinese, but Asian and, African and South American, European students in Australia. Even now, we've got far less than we had a year ago, but even now we do. And I think people will always have that underlying resentment as well. Yeah. A small proportion of people will. And now when we're in a situation where there is just this fear, it brings out people's unreasonable behaviour. But it's unreasonable in a sense that it makes no sense. That
if you were to
yelling at a person who looks Chinese in the main street in Melbourne, it's sort of like, what? She brought the coronavirus with her? Like, seriously?
And by yelling at her, you prevent yourself from catching it.
Yeah, yeah. But that's being a pre-coronavirus, and I actually don't think it's any more prevalent now than it was a year ago.
The racism.
Well,
people are just paying attention
to
it
just now. It's the only story we can tell. Yeah. I actually did a little pot survey on last 2 nights of watching the ABC News, I do the ABC because it doesn't have advertising in it, so that you can do a half hour news is a half hour of television. Yeah. And in a half an hour of television, there's 4 or 5 minutes of sport and there's about 3 minutes of weather. So you take out that 8 minutes, so it's 22 minutes. 18 minutes last night and about 17 or 18 minutes the night before were coronavirus stories. Yeah. Now, the real coronavirus story is how many people died, how many people have been recently identified as having the disease, and what are the latest things, what advice from government. That takes 3 or 4 minutes. The rest of them are so-called human interest stories. And with all of us, and particularly with the media, human interest stories are now what went wrong stories. They're not the who did the right thing and all the good stuff that happens. They're who screwed up stories.
Well, and they're the ones that get the clicks and the attention,
exactly.
Right? And so that's what you say, racist attack in Melbourne, and everyone's like, oh my God, what happened?
Exactly. If we'd had a woman of Chinese origin attacked by another woman, incidentally, in the street of Melbourne,
that was weird.
A year ago, it never would have made the news.
Well, it wouldn't have made any sense, right?
No.
It just doesn't have any broader
It doesn't have any context.
Ramifications.
Yeah. Now, we're tying the context here. Yeah. We're assuming context, and it's adding to that whole coronavirus story.
Do you think it's irresponsibility on the part of the media?
Yeah, of course.
Because it's kind of like they're saying, oh my God, coronavirus is making the average Australian racist. Yeah. And it's not happening.
It's like saying,
right?
it's like using I beat my wife, but it's okay because I was drunk. I'm sorry. The underlying behaviour was there. All the alcohol did was loosen your inhibition a little bit. Like you
crashed because I was drunk. It's like,
I'm sorry. It's just, it's okay to be racist if it's coronavirus related, but I don't think so.
Do you think Australia is a racist country?
Yes, every country is.
How would you describe it? Because, I mean, people ask me that quite often, and I don't really know how to give them a solid answer. And whilst you're describing it, has the racism changed throughout time?
No. Its targets have changed.
Yeah.
Look, I think Australia is, by and large, a very welcoming culture.
Yeah.
I don't think if you say Australia is a racist culture, the Australians are racist, you go, I'm sorry, there's 25 million Australians. How many of you counted and observed and watched and so on?
Yeah.
And there will be a small minority of people who act offensively to other people based on race. We have moved away, 60 years ago, we moved away from a racist government policy of the White Australia policy, which was in order to immigrate to Australia, you had to be of European origin.
Why was that brought? Was that a fear thing?
Yeah, of course it was.
And was it just trying to maintain social homogeneity, like trying to keep everyone the same?
Yeah.
But the weird thing is, we look at that as incredibly racist. We look back on the White Australia policy as massively racist. At the time, there were you couldn't come in unless you were of European descent. So, but even then, you could come in as long as you were white, effectively. So you could speak other languages, you could have other different cultures, you could still come in.
You'd be an axe murderer, but,
We don't criticise China or Japan for having the exact same setup. In fact, we support it. And we think, good on them for supporting their own culture and trying to maintain their own culture. How do you square that?
Yeah, look, it is a challenging one. I think the difference with Australia is that, and places like America, to a lesser extent, some European countries more recently, but we're a country of immigrants.
Yeah.
Other than the single-figure percentage of people who identify as Indigenous in this country, everybody else is an immigrant.
Well,
the best case you can possibly have is about 7 or 8 generations of living in Australia.
Unless you've got
unless you're Indigenous
one, in which case you'd have thousands.
Yeah, exactly. But when you look at it that way, it's different to say what Australia's culture, modern Australian culture, is an immigrant culture. Yeah. We're a melting pot of hundreds of different nationalities of people, and that's different from Japan or China, where Japan in particular, 100 and something million people.
Yeah,
99.99% of which could trace their Japanese heritage back generations.
But not only that, I think, from what I understand, I can't become Japanese.
No.
I can't get a Japanese citizenship. I can't buy property in Japan.
Yeah.
Even if I live there, even if I have a job there, even if I marry a Japanese person.
You can go and live there and work there forever, but you cannot be considered to be Japanese.
That's weird...
my understanding.
I just can't get my head around that, though, in terms of what are they? There's a Portuguese expression that's like one weight, two different measures or something like that, where it's like double standards effectively.
Yes.
And I don't get how the West is so self-denigrating in terms of anyone who says Western culture is amazing and we should try and preserve it. Not even a racial thing. Yeah. It's kind of like, ooh, that's a bit racist.
The thing is, though, what's Western culture?
Well, and that's how you want to define it is whatever.
Because it is that that melting pot.
Yes.
Now there have been some obvious very recent cases of particularly some European countries with mass immigration of millions of people from the Middle East who are coming in not with just necessarily different cultural views but different religious views.
Yeah.
And that is effectively changing the mix just on a numerical basis.
Well, and
you've got Sweden with a population of 10 million people, and they've got 1 million immigrants that have come in with a different religious point of view.
That's where we need to be able to have that discussion at least, because it isn't a binary thing. It's not our country either needs to be completely mixed or it needs to be just white or just Indian or just Japanese, right? But there is somewhere on that continuum where the benefits of either mixing it up or keeping it homogenous starts to fade away and become potentially negative, right? And that's what's happening in Japan, as far as I know, with their aging population, because they don't rely on immigration. Yeah. Then they're suffering economically, and they're going to have to change something up in the future to try and deal with that. And
look, Japan's an interesting sort of economic case, and I'm not an economist, so apologies to all my economist friends. But Japan is an interesting sort of economic case study in that sense, in that it's a very old culture. Modern Japanese culture is hundreds of years old. The truly modern Japanese economy was created after the Second World War. So their economy was based on coming out of losing a war, and they relied on becoming the world's biggest manufacturer of manufactured goods for general household use, electronic goods, toys, all of those sort of things that we spend thousands of dollars a year on. Were traditionally, certainly for the 1950s, 60s and 70s, 90% of them were made in Japan. Then China came along, and lots of other smaller economies decided that they could make some of these things as well. And so made in Japan went to made in China. And so that easy, cheap stuff that you used to be able to get out of Japan got taken over by China, and the high quality electronic goods got taken over by South Korea. And so South Korea is now the most technologically developed country in the world. So they've moved into where Japan was, and China have taken the bottom out of the Japanese economy. So they're really not left with much. Now they're still doing pretty well, but with the ageing population as well, it's just a different economic structure from the one that was set up 70 years ago. So yeah, it's an interesting case study of sort of national economic strategies and where you go, and combined with that hundreds of years old culture as well. It's a really interesting one. I haven't studied much of Japanese history, but it's a really interesting case.
I think back to what is Australian culture, the thing that we should be talking about when we do talk about culture is more our values, right? Our shared values, and that's what needs to be protected. And that's the main reason so many immigrants want to come to our countries, because of the values that we have, that they share, that they're trying to adopt and escape from places or regimes where those values aren't held up. And the problem is that we have to work out a way of taking in a fair number of people for our own benefit, whilst working out at what point do we need to sort of taper that off to maintain the values, to allow these people to, switch over, become quote unquote Australian in terms of their culture and value systems. Because if you suddenly put 25 million Japanese people in Australia, it's no longer Australia, right? If you suddenly put 25 million people in the place of Japan and there's no Japanese people there, it's no longer Japan, right? It's not just geography. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future, though, because, like the coronavirus and how everyone's trying to deal with it in different ways, it seems like people are trying to deal with globalism in different ways.
Yeah, and I think I'm hardly one to start predicting what's going to happen on a global economic basis, but it will be interesting to look at what happens as we move out of this coronavirus situation into a new global economy. I think globalisation it'll still be there, it'll always be there, because we now have 50% of the stuff I buy now comes from overseas. Other than food, and half of that comes from overseas. But I'd buy it on the internet. Buy it on eBay for $20, and it'll come out of the United States or somewhere in Europe or China or Hong Kong or wherever, or Japan, and it arrives on my doorstep 5 days later. Pre-coronavirus. Now it's 5 weeks later. But so we're in a global economy, and we can't get out of that. Because now, just from your average person buying and selling things, we can buy and sell to anywhere in the world. We don't need our country to do that on our behalf, and then we choose what we buy or what we sell based on what comes in or goes out of our country. So I think that's going to change now, because who knows when we're going to be travelling internationally again, in a big way. That's my Qantas shares are going down the toilet, but
Jesus.
So we may well end up with a meta country with New Zealand in the medium term. What
do you mean by that?
Well, we will treat each other like a single country not in terms of politics and so on, but in terms of travel. I think as soon as we open up in Australia, as soon as we open up travel interstate, allowing people to fly interstate, then we'll open up travel to and from New Zealand.
Because we can pretty much do whatever we want in terms of going there without visas and staying there permanently, right? But we just can't get government payments. I don't think so, right? New Zealanders can't move to Australia and just be like, give me the dole or give me Medicare. I'm not sure.
Yes, they can.
Can they? No kidding.
You don't need to be... You can be a New Zealand citizen, move to Australia, and you're all automatically entitled to the same government payments, is my understanding. All
right. And they say we're racist. Yeah. We let New Zealanders in with nothing.
So,
sheep shaggers. The sheep shaggers coming over here.
When I first went to New Zealand, I didn't have a passport. You didn't need a passport to go to New Zealand. It was like flying to Perth. You just fly into Auckland, get off the plane, and away you go. The
last story I had here before we finish up was the Norfolk Island Morepork. I think it's a Morepork owl. Is that what it's called? Morepork owl?
We would call them a boobook owl in southern Australia.
So these guys have made a major breakthrough for the rare species. They are one of the world's rarest owls, and they have only recently had 2 owl chicks survive to become fledglings, which is the first time in 10 years. So there have been no known successful breeding seasons since 2011. And there are less than 50 Morepork owls in the wild in Norfolk Island, and the population declined all the way down to a single female in 1980. So it was effectively extinct. But it was brought back by New Zealander owls that were brought over and then released. So it was an interesting story. Every owl now has a lineage that goes back to that one female, and I guess technically they're hybrid subspecies, though.
Yes. Well, I think the New Zealand one was the same subspecies. It wasn't the New Zealand. It wasn't the New Zealand. My understanding was that the New Zealand bird was more related to the Norfolk Island bird than the Southern Australian birds were. Hence taking one from New Zealand. So, I mean, whether we call them subspecies or species or whatever, I mean, I don't tell you, this is your profession. Yeah. It's completely arbitrary. But my understanding is that from a DNA perspective, the Norfolk Island bird was more related to the New Zealand one. So, yeah, they're now a hybrid. They're not the pure Norfolk Island birds anymore.
Yeah. But they've produced these hybrids in order to conserve the species. And in order to help, though, they've had to try and really reduce rat predators, building nest boxes, and that has led to the first chicks in over 10 years. But what do you think in terms of that sort of conservation? Is it useful in terms of, are you actually conserving the species by creating hybrids? Because the interesting situation for broader context in Australia, for instance, is that we have dingoes on the mainland, but we don't consider them dingoes anymore because they've hybridized with dogs.
Yeah.
And so they're wild dogs that we now kill and don't let roam wild, but they look like dingoes and they potentially behave like dingoes. Yes. So it's weird that we have these double standards in this situation where sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, in the end, I think it comes down to it's the old thing. I mean, having worked at the zoo, at Melbourne Zoo for 3 years, and people would often ask, well, what's the purpose of a zoo? And the purpose of zoos went from entertainment to conservation over a period of decades.
You can't throw peanuts at the elephants anymore.
All those sort of things, yeah, exactly. And that's conservation on multiple levels, but the two big ones are that zoos can work in breeding programs that will ultimately increase populations to where the wild populations can then be added to, so you can release back into the wild. The second thing is it's about conservation education. And I put this, Norfolk Island Morepork into that conservation education thing. Frankly, 99.999% of people in the world are not even going to know, let alone care, if that one female bird had died.
Yeah.
And that the subspecies population went extinct. The fact that we can and have successfully maintained a population and now it is self-breeding, I think then comes there. It's a signature project.
Look what we can do.
It's the look what we can do, and that gets people excited about opportunities for what we can do. We lost the last northern black rhino in the world a couple of years ago, where the last northern black rhino was a male and he died.
Yeah. Which is a subspecies of black rhinos.
Subspecies of black rhinos. And we didn't have that opportunity. There weren't any females around that we could continue that subspecies. I've actually, speaking of Norfolk Island birds, I've donated money to another bird conservation project in Norfolk Island, which is a little green parakeet.
Yeah.
There, again, very rare. And the reason I donated money to it was because of what they were doing with it is that they, the group that were working on them, took Phillip Island, which is a little island off the coast of Norfolk Island, and completely...
I thought you were talking about the one in Victoria.
No, not the one in Victoria. No,
like,
everybody thinks that. As soon as you say Phillip Island, they go, penguins and koalas. And great white sharks.
Yeah.
No, it's a small island that for about 10 years... there was a lot of effort.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.